I'm Sayu Bojwani. I'm the Executive Director of New American Leaders and a board member of AAPI Progressive Action. My day job is helping first and second generation Americans run for office. And so we're very excited not only about what happened at the top of the ballot, but also down ballot. We know that Joe Biden won with a record-breaking 80 million plus votes, many of which are a result of the hard work of our panelists, whom you're going to hear from. You know, we say that he reclaimed the blue wall, but I'd like to say he reclaimed the New American majority in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, won Georgia and Arizona. And although we didn't win some swing states, we saw record AAPI turnout and hope to flip some of those states in the near future. The panelists you're going to hear from, I'm going to introduce them very briefly, and then they'll be talking about their work. And I'll start off with a question focused on Georgia. So we have first Aisha Mahmood, who is director of the Asian American Advocacy Fund, which advocates for civil and human rights of AAPIs in Georgia. Chavi Koneru, who is the co-founder and executive director of NCAT in Action. Mohan Sheshadri is political director of the Asian Pacific Islander Political Alliance, growing the political power of AAPIs in Pennsylvania. David Lee, co-founder and president of Texas Signal, a media organization dedicated to spreading progressive messages and counterbalancing right-wing media in that state. And Jennifer Chow, who is the director of the Arizona AANHPI for Equity Coalition, which has conducted voter engagement and census outreach to amplify the voice of the fastest growing community in the state. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the work that you did to bring home results for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris this year. I want to start first with Aisha because Georgia is on all of our minds. And then I'll ask if each of you could answer, you know, what are some of the lessons that you all learned in doing the organizing work that you did on the ground this year? Obviously, it looked very different because of the pandemic, and hopefully that will never happen again. Although Georgia will continue to be working within the context of COVID-19. So starting with you, Aisha, share with us what are some lessons that you learned during this election cycle that we'll be able to use for the January 5th runoff and future elections.
Hi, thank you, Sayu. Thanks everyone at API Progressive Action for having us on this call. It's so great to see everyone in the same space, especially after an incredibly busy election cycle. As you know, the work for us in Georgia is not quite over, but we have already started to pick up on some important lessons learned from this past cycle. COVID did not make things easy, but we were able to really quickly mobilize and shift our programs into having a safer program during the general election. That meant shifting a lot of our capacity into the phones and texts and really getting creative with digital and ethnic media. I will say that we really missed out on some meaningful conversations because we were not at the doors in the general election. And so we made a conscious decision for our runoff to actually do that and get back on the doors. So we're running a pretty massive field program for the next 6 weeks to make sure that we can have those important conversations, but also do the persuasion that's necessary to make sure that every single voter turns out again on January 5th to help us flip the Senate. Just another, I guess, a big takeaway from this cycle was that the work that happens 3 or 4 months before an election cycle is incredibly important, but the work that has been put in to organizing in our communities for the last many, many years is really what got us to these victories. It wasn't something that happened overnight. Georgia didn't flip blue overnight. It was after years and years of organizing within communities of color and with what little investment that we had. So if we were able to perform at the scales that we did with very little investment, I'm very excited to see what we can do when all eyes and all money is coming to us this January. So I'm sure I'll touch on some more throughout the panel.
Chavi, let's go over to you.
Sure. Thank you. And also want to add that I really appreciate that we're having this panel a month after the election, because it's given us an opportunity to really think through our lessons learned. So I am the executive director of North Carolina Asian Americans. We are a statewide organization in North Carolina. And we're the first organization that's a C4 and that is reaching out to the Pan-Asian community in the state. So as Sayu said, we are one of those swing states that unfortunately Trump did end up winning, but the AAPI turnout was impressive, and that's what gives us a lot of hope and helps us feel like there's something to build on. And echoing what Aisha said, I want to start by saying that our organization, our C3 was only founded in 2016, and our C4 started this year. So this work didn't happen overnight, and we are building on what local communities were already doing. So some of our other lessons learned this year, I think one of the biggest was our 18 to 25 API vote increased 88% the turnout, and that's from 2016, and that is just early vote and vote by mail since we don't have election day results yet, which is huge. And we learned through this process that part of the reason was that we were engaging youth, focused more on down ballot races, local impact, because they weren't as interested in electoral politics or who was going to win the presidential race. So that's something we're definitely going to continue doing, focusing our program on more issue-based and local impact stuff. And then the other thing was we always knew language access was an issue, but I think it took the pandemic to help us realize that it is probably, I would go as far as to say, is the biggest issue that cuts across all socioeconomic classes, or all ethnicities in the API community. And that became really evident during the pandemic when people didn't have resources to apply for PPP loans or health access. So we focused a lot of our attention and our funding on creating multilingual materials. We did end up starting in-person work again in September because there was some communities we just couldn't reach without being out there and able to talk to them. And we also focused on working with micro communities and having them sort of do the work of reaching out to their own members. And that resulted in being about 3 times more effective than we were used to calls being. So those are some of our highlights.
I can go next. Hey folks, my name is Mohan Seshadri and I'm the political director for API-PA, the Asian Pacific Islander Political Alliance, which is Pennsylvania's statewide Asian American advocacy organization. And similar to some of the other folks here, Pennsylvania's first API C4. And I just want to echo especially what folks have said about the importance of investing early and from the ground up. So our leadership, and specifically our 2 co-executive directors, come out of and are currently the EDs of 2 501c3 nonprofits in the Philly area, Viet Lead and Asian Americans United. And so while API-PA as an entity only launched in July and kind of hit the ground running immediately with program, both being able to launch in July rather than September or October, and then having a base that was rooted in a combined 40 years of work serving our communities meant that we were able to scale up quickly and ended up running a program that I think at last count achieved some 2 million attempts plus relational organizing plus digital ads and things like that. And then the second thing I wanted to echo is just also the importance of language access. Thanks to our relationships with bases across the state, we're able to, in addition to our regular calls and our regular texts, which had language support for up to 10 languages, but weren't necessarily in language, we also dedicated specific capacity to Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, Korean, and South Asian calls, specifically targeting elders in those communities and using not just in language materials, but also specifically messaging that we've developed with dedicated organizers in those communities to identify what specific needs each of those groups would actually care about, what messaging we should use, and then what we can actually iterate and test over time to figure out exactly what we need to do to meet our people where we're at. And then lastly, I think a similar takeaway as the others ended up repeating a lot of what folks have said, but that's also because they're entirely right. We actually made the conscious decision to not go into the field in person at all. And I think that something that I wish we had done differently and something we'll be doing differently in the future is figuring out a way to do that safely. We heard from our communities really early on that they didn't want any in-person work, that they'd rather calls and texts and relational organizing, their aunt calling them and being like, hey, I hear you haven't voted, what's up with that? And I think that we're missing a whole bunch of our communities who just aren't going to pick up the phone for a stranger whose numbers aren't listed. And especially those folks tend to be more working class, more housing insecure, with families that may be insecure in terms of immigration status, things like that, folks who tend to be on the margins and who it's our job to center in our work. And so going forward, one of the things we're spending the next couple of months doing is actually figuring out what and where we can actually do in-person work as our communities get back to in-person, so that we're able to actually run safe, COVID-safe, door-to-door and in-person programs in 2021 and every year after that for as long as we need to.
Great, thank you. Jennifer, do you want to jump in and talk to us about Arizona?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Jennifer. I'm the director for AZAA and HPI for Equity. So that's the C3 side. We started last year in July just to organize. We're a coalition of 9 AA and HPI groups, organizations working together on census and voter engagement. So we started a little early, but just to give you a little background with Arizona, there's just very little investment in the AA and HPI community. All the groups are mainly volunteer driven organizations. I would say out of the 9 groups, 2 have maybe one or 2 paid staff in their org. So the state of Arizona, that there's only 2 orgs that do have paid staff working in community. So initially when I started this coalition, it's just, I felt like, if we work in coalition, working together, we'll be able to make greater impact, and building on resources, mobilizing effectively, we will all work together. And I think that, worked out really well. Every time we had an event, if we had a text party, all of our coalition members would just like gather their membership base or their volunteers, and we would always average like 30, 40 volunteers doing texting or phone banking or just events, virtual events and stuff like that. And we wanted to play off like our members' strengths. So for example, like we have 2 Pacific Islander groups. I hired a few organizers from that community because for them, they've been around for a while, like, in the community for like several decades. So they're trusted messengers. So, and I would say like, oh, why don't you do like phone banking, text banking, or certain things to organize to get the message out on voting? But they're like, no, you got to understand, like with our community, some of us don't have technology. We don't have phones. We don't have online access. So the best way to do voter registration is dropping off these voter registration forms. We'll leave it on their doorstep. We'll let them know it's outside. We'll pick it up afterwards. So those were some of the tactics, like since they knew their communities the best. So I'm like, okay, if you think that's the best way, have at it, go for it. I trust you. So each, members were able to really utilize their strengths. We did a voter suppression training, virtual training. One of our partners, NAPOF, like they did a really amazing job, like doing a virtual training for all their members, but they gave us the toolkit. So all of our members were able to do Facebook Lives and doing trainings like that. So those are some of the examples of what we've been able to do and organize. But I think this year, having that investment in voter outreach to the AA and HPI community was vital to our success in making sure that our communities are contacted, because there was a recent survey that said that there was hardly any contact in the AA and HPI community, in the Democratic Party, Republican Party, or even like nonprofits. There wasn't even really too much nonprofits or community-based orgs doing that work. So there was just very little contact at all. So I think with 2020, we used a multi-prong approach. We did texting, we did phone banking, we started a youth program with 21 civic engagement fellows. We did mailers and Vietnamese and Chinese. So it was a statewide effort, and I think this year we were like, okay, we went from having very little contact to like, we're gonna nag you to death to make sure that you're gonna get the message on how to vote. Where's your early voting polls are at, or here's a link to make sure that you're in the early voting. We really highly encourage that because of COVID. So just, I think having that investment so we could do all those contact opportunities for communities was very vital to being able to outreach. And just looking back at 2016, the Arizona AA NHPI voter turnout was only 46%. And then if you look at 2020, I think the numbers, I think last time I saw it was like in the 70s or low 80s. Like that's a dramatic like increase. It nearly doubled. So I'm really proud with all of our coalition members. We really worked hard together. The last 2 weeks we did do canvassing, but I felt like canvassing was one thing that I wish we were able to do. But during these times it just was really difficult. And I could give you like a really quick example. Like I went to my favorite Chinese restaurant let's just say like a month prior to the voter registration deadline, or actually, yeah. So for her, she's a Chinese immigrant worker, never been in Arizona for like 20 years. And for her, she's like, you know what? And I was just canvassing at the time, or I had voter registration forms, and I asked her, I was like, hey, do you want to register to vote? And she's like, yes. And then she's all, white people have approached me before, and I said no on voter registration, but I trust you. I've known you. I see you all the time. So I'll do this. And she said this several times, like, I trust you, that I'm going to fill it out, hand it to you, and it's all going to be okay. So I know like we have to be that trusted messenger in order to make sure like they feel comfortable even voting. With our immigrant communities, they don't feel comfortable sometimes with the voting process or even voting. So
thank you, Jennifer. That's a great story on which to end. I'd love to give David a chance to weigh in. David, we're waiting for Texas to join the Blue Party. And I wonder if you could talk about the lessons from this year and where you see your state headed in the next couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And before I begin, I just want to thank you, Sayu, for all your work with New American Leaders. And we're just so excited for your next venture. And so I just wanted to start with that. But yeah, Texas was, it's a big prize, and we knew the work was going to be hard, but there was a lot of stuff that didn't go our way down ballot, but in terms of the community engagement stuff that has happened across the state, I've been very heartened by that. And I think a lot of these C4s and organizations that have formed really in the past like 5 years, we also have to understand that this is like a 20-year plus game that we need to build these organizations up for the long term. So yeah, one of the big kind of, so I along with Sonal Shah, who is Pete Buttigieg's National Policy Director, we were the co-chairs for the Texas AAPI Victory Project, which was incubated out of Progressive Action and the AAPI Victory Fund. And so we brought in, we brought in a lot of different donors and players who wanted to really help the AAPI community here get organized and vote. And one of the starkest kind of lessons that we realized was in a lot of these communities, especially when the candidate was API, 5 of the 10 red to blue races here in Texas were AAPI candidates, which is just phenomenal. However, we saw a lot of intra AAPI community kind of cleavages, show up through a lot of these like electoral means. And so that was kind of very disheartening to see. However, it really shows that we need a consistent organization, entity that kind of is the almost like a lightning rod to dissipate a lot of these kind of very contentious things that come up in various different communities. And so there, the messaging, the rapid response portion of that is going to be so crucial. And I'm lucky enough to work with Varun and Tang, and who knew that we need to spend some of that money that we raised for the long term. And so we're putting resources into stuff for the next stages, which you get the biggest bang for your buck, right? When you start early. And so I've been telling donors, like, don't focus as much on the election. Let's focus on the next 3 cycles, because that's what's going to really what it takes, especially in the South here. Also, in terms of the modeling, that was just such a miss for so many states. And I think that really I don't know how other states did it, but I think the most important thing for our community is to include to listen to community leaders for sure, but to also include kind of random sampling of community members. And there are kind of consulting firms have these like databases of like random numbers to call, and I think we need to kind of tap into that and kind of add that component into our and a lot of models do that, but we need to like pay specific attention to that. And I know the state Democratic Party is also looking into that more. And so yeah, that's I mean it's hard work. We knew it was going to be hard, but this is for the long term for our community, and so it's worth it.
Thanks, David. And we see that, right? We see in Arizona and Georgia what the impact of long-term investment, even minimal long-term investment, can be. So lots of great lessons here. Would have been great to knock on the doors, important to have trusting messengers. In some cases, important to engage with younger folks on local issues if they're not motivated by the top of the ticket. We could keep talking for a while, but we're almost out of time. I did want to give Aisha an opportunity to talk a little bit about what can be done, what can we all do about Georgia, what can we all do in your state for our country. So if you could talk to us about that, that would be great.
Thank you, Sayu. Well, I think the question on everyone's mind is how can we help and what can we do to support? And I just want to thank everyone for all the support that they've already shown us. So many people on this call have already done so much, but we are right now gearing up to make sure that our field program is solid and making sure that we have enough people to help us knock on doors. I know that there's been some hesitation for people who want to come to Georgia, but what we're asking for is if people have very specific language skills and if they're able to commit at least a week of time, please help us come and knock on some doors. I will drop a link in the chat in a minute for how to get signed up to do volunteering. We've partnered with Seed the Vote to help us really manage the flow of volunteers and take on some of the cost burden to make sure that our volunteers can have some of their housing and transportation covered. But come and knock on doors with us. If you can't come to Georgia, we also need a lot of support on the phones to make calls and text messages, especially if you have language skills. Those are always very much needed. So I'll drop the link in the chat in a few minutes, but also fundraising, we're still trying to raise money to fill in some of those field and phone gaps. So whatever you can do to support. A few weeks ago, we launched our Asians for Ossoff and Warnock campaign, which is our official campaign to help elect Jon Ossoff and Raphael Warnock to the U.S. Senate. So I'll drop the link to our campaign and how you can donate directly to our PAC. Otherwise, come out and show your support through volunteering, but really help us spread the message and share the story of AAPI voters in Georgia. We're hoping that after January 5th, we're not able to just take control of the U.S. Senate, but we're able to further spread the message of AAPI voters really being the margin of victory, not just in November, but continuing to be the margin of victory in key races.
Thank you, Aisha. Thank you to all of you, Chavi, Mohan, David, and Jennifer. To the many of you who've signed on, many of you ran for office, and we want to acknowledge how important it is to have voices like ours up and down the ballot to also motivate AAPI voters. And let's all remember that we're in it for the long game. One voter at a time and one race at a time will be able to continue building this democracy so that it works for all of us. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Sayu, for the great moderation, and thank you to the panel as well. Very enlightening, and certainly the 20 minutes or so that we had allocated for this panel does not do any justice at all to the amazing work, historic work that was done on the ground. So congratulations to all of our great leaders in all those respective states.